and international. And I'll be moderating this session. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Online attendees, please use the Q&A box to type your questions to the presenter. On-site attendees, I'll be coming round with a microphone, so raise your hands at the end of the session if you want to ask a question. I'm now pleased to introduce Stefan. I'm sorry, I don't know your colleagues.
Stefan and Stefan.
Also Stefan. Oh, well, okay, I should have just said Stefan, yeah. From Medical University of Graz, who will be presenting German Translation Group, Experiences and Challenges of a Common German Translation Initiative. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for your kind welcome. I was just present to you an initiative that started some years ago concerning the German translation of SNOMED together with Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. And most of this presentation will be held from a real expert, the brain behind this initiative, Stefan Schulz. Just referring the beginnings, you know that we have about 100 million people speaking German worldwide, and the biggest countries are Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And since all these three countries are now members of SNOMED International, members of the family, we started an initiative in 2020 from the representatives from Austria, Germany, and also Luxembourg and Switzerland to join together and join our forces to bring forward a new translation of SNOMED. The goals were to explore what we had already of German translations and to look what we have for resources and ongoing activities. And the plan was to harmonize our activities on a common ground. So we established regular meetings between us and what we saw that we had already existing translations. There was an old German translation from 2003 with some thousand translations of and concepts, and we had already a starter set, and we produced a German starter guide together. I think it was primarily translated by the Swiss, and we had a look together and finished it together, and we thought that it was very pragmatic that every one of us, every country, should translate what they really need primarily, and then just translate that what they could do and provide. So that's for the start. So we have harmonized translation activities, we have regular meetings and shared documentation platform. And I think this was to start the presentation. Now I hand over to Stefan.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. And also I just want to highlight that there are some other people from this group here in the room which equally contributed. And the thing which really was at the beginning of our activities was the elaboration of a German translation guideline. And this is a very, very important step, because you cannot just start translating without any guidance. So such a guideline should establish detailed rules how the content is to be translated so as to reach a maximum of consensus between translators, and also to anticipate recurring problems which just would consume a lot of time and probably also produce inconsistencies in the translation if the same issues are raised again and again. And fortunately, we didn't have to reinvent the rule, because reinvent the reel, because this reel was already invented first by SNOMED International with translation recommendations. But then what was very important, the guidelines established by our Francophone colleagues, and we used this as a kind of blueprint we systematically studied the French guideline, and item by item, we looked at their applicability to the German language, but also identifying specific issues for German. And we released in 2021 the first version of the translation guideline. We are now revisiting the guideline, and we expect that the guideline will go to several rounds just due to the feedback we get from the translators. Okay, so here 2 slides just highlighting some of issues which really led to lots of discussions, but interesting, fruitful discussions within the group. So there was a consensus at the very beginning that we would not translate fully specified names. The FSNs would be in English. And again, that we followed what has been proposed, I think more than a decade or 2 decades ago from SNOMED International or IHCSTO at that time, is a so-called concept-based translation. So that the attempt is really to understand the meaning of the concept via the FSN, but also via its hierarchical context and formal definitions. So then that means, for instance, that we do not look at the English synonyms, because they could be misleading in some cases. Another important decision was taken with regard to the number of synonyms. Of course, we could not include all variations of language, because this would be a bottomless pit. But we are open to add, let's say, common synonyms. And we formulated as a recommendation that web frequencies of corpus frequencies are also considered as a decision aid, whether or not to include a certain term. Yeah, but so far we have not established an upper bound, such as, for instance, at most 5 synonyms or so. This we have left open on purpose. And also regarding the acceptability of synonyms, we had to take into account that the 3 countries, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, really have certain preferences, certain kind of dialects, where really some words in one country would not be that acceptable in another one, or a preferred term in one would not be a preferred term in other one, but which then should be tagged as acceptable is in charge of each NRC. So another issue which led to heated discussions was how to translate the top concepts of the sub-hierarchies in SNOMED, such as qualifier value, observer entity, clinical finding, because the exact meaning of them was only partly covered by the SNOMED CT documentation. Of course, all of us had a rough understanding what it means or what it meant, especially when looking at the content underneath. But literal translation, for instance, of something like clinical finding would really not be very good, because this would evoke completely different meanings. So, for instance, I think we spent 3-4 hours to create a consensus that, for instance, clinical finding would be translated to klinisch relevante Erscheinung, which would be clinically relevant phenomenon. Yeah? Because finding is too much in German language, too much attached to the meaning of sign. Yeah? Okay, but this is probably a question, an issue which comes up also in other translation projects. So then we identified frequent word sequence frequencies, because we found out that many terms in SNOMED are really built in a very regular fashion. And so, for instance, the word sequence co-occurrent and due to occurred 565 times. And so it is very helpful to translate this, let's say, term fragment just once and offer them as kind of pre-translation to the translators. For instance, here we translated as gleichzeitig auftretend mit und verursacht durch. And then we have this typical feature of German language, namely single word compounds. For instance, fracture of humerus is called Oberarmfraktur. It's in one word, and normally we give preference to those multi-word expressions. But again, this is not a very strict rule. If there is evidence that such multi-word terms are not so preferred compared to their multi-word synonyms, then we prefer the multi-word synonyms. Yeah, then what's specifically an issue in German is that the spelling rules are very complicated, and normally only medical publishers really use them and know them and understand them. That means that often clinicians write a bit differently, which is not a problem for communication and understanding, but it's a problem for defining which is really the correct translation. And so we followed rules by medical publishers and medical dictionaries, which explain that, for instance, carcinome is written with K and calcium is written with C. Yeah? That's complicated and I think only historically justified. So we really had to consider a lot of particular rules regarding capitalization, hyphenation, plurals, especially for loan words. Yeah, then we are open to very common but non-canonic spelling variants allowed as acceptable synonyms. For instance, esophagus instead of what should be written with O, with umlaut, OE, which often is also seen as canonic. Then we looked at gender-sensitive language. We introduced patterns how to refer to both genders. And then an issue which is really important in German, that you cannot say fracture of femur. You have to decide whether it's fracture of the femur or fraction of a femur. And so we had also certain rules that, for instance, you use the definite article for those anatomical entities which occur only once, and at least for those which occur multiple times, for instance, tooth, then we use the indefinite article. Yeah, and then some other minor things, how to deal with subscripts, superscripts, and so on. So let's come now to the tooling and the workflow. So the tooling is heavily supported by SNOMED International tools, which are available free of charge, which is really very, very good support. And I won't read out loud everything you can read here, but it's first, it's a ref set and translation tool. So you see, then it's the SNOMED community browser, also which allows public feedback. Then I think I'm preaching to the choir. Confluence everybody is using, and it has turned out as a very useful platform. And then also the authoring platform, particularly because it also can be the basis for already existing German translations, so that you can import translations, and so that is also quite useful for our project. So the workflow starts with use case definitions by the national release centers. Yeah, it should perhaps be NRCs, because according to the country, there are different use cases, different priorities. Yeah, then they can provide translation resources, set deadlines, and then the activities of the German translation group, GTG, comes into play. So documenting ongoing translations, looking at existing translations, and then the translation process is started. Then a notice of the conclusion of the translation is then produced and submitted to group review, and then it's published, but it's fed back to group review so that this published translations in the community browser can still be revised. So therefore, there's this probably will be quite iterative for many cases. For others, it's quite straightforward. Yeah, and then the release as translation in a national extension. Okay, so what have we learned? What have we achieved? Well, what we can say so far is that good tooling is fundamental to cope with the complexity of translation. And we are well served by SNOMED tools, but of course, some tools also could be improved. Defining harmonized translation rules is really something which takes time, but it's very important. And also the following of these rules has to be monitored. And also regarding the rules in the translation guideline, what we have agreed on and which looks very nice on paper or in conference, then will turn out perhaps be more tricky when it's really implemented and used by the translators. So we always need feedback from within the group and from the public, from the users, which is supported by the tooling. And another lesson was that really maintaining such a group, defining processes, planning, meetings, etc., takes time and effort. And such a group really should keep the same level of commitment during years, because such a translation really is something which will last over many years. And it's also helpful to change a coordinating party at regular intervals. So these achievements, I don't need to read out loud, but you see that we are now in the third year, and really we have produced that translation guidelines. We have received feedback, we have established workflows, and first translated content is already available in the community browser. And so the first national extension, namely the Austrian extension, was released 1 month ago. Okay, so outlook. Well, of course, we have to handle also content that has changed in the international edition. Currently, of course, we have started with focusing on adding new translations, but the more complete it is, the more important will be also to keep pace with the evolution of SNOMED CT. And here are just some items of priority for German translations: vaccination, adverse reactions, allergies, diseases, administration, products, substances, manifestation units. You see, it's a very, very broad range. There is already microbiology content, a certain attention is given to devices, to pregnancy-related content, and also ICNP, good connection to the previous presentation, etc. So I think I'm at the end. Is there? Yeah. Any questions? And sorry that really I should have added another slide also with the names of all people who contributed, but you see their names if you visit our page on conference. And so I'm quite optimistic that we will keep on this with a good speed, and that perhaps we get inspirations and feedback also from other translation teams, but also that we can inspire other teams which are still planning their translation strategy with our experiences. So thank you very much.
Okay, we've got one question online, and then I'll go to the room to see if there are any further questions, but please wait till I come to you with the mic before asking. So the question online is from Marta Serna Garcia. Are translations made by professional translators or physicians?
Yeah, ideally by professional translators who are physicians, but yeah. We are still in the process of recruiting translators, and perhaps anybody from the group can answer this question better than me.
I can answer that. We currently don't have any professional translators. We just translate. So the NRCs are translating, and they have experiences in translating ICD-11 and other code systems. So this is quite good, but they're mostly physicians or coming from other medical backgrounds.
Yeah, I'm Ole Våge from the Norwegian NRC. We are also translating into Norwegian now, so it was really useful, interesting presentation by Stefan. I have a question regarding the guidelines, because you pointed at different sources, medical dictionaries, text corpus, etc. What do you do when there are clashes between, say, a spelling in a medical dictionary and usage in a text corpus? Which one would kind of win the battle of becoming the preferred term? Do you have any general rules for that?
Yeah, so far, and I think that this is an agreement, we would follow the official dictionary. But if there is such a clash that, for instance, there is much more spelling of carcinome with C than with K in, let's say, a reference corpus, then this could be reason to add it as an acceptable synonym. But we find it's very important to have some kind of authoritative source, because otherwise it's really difficult. You just, and then you end up with endless discussions, which is nicer or better or more correct spelling. Yeah.
Sorry. Here, question.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Does it work? Irina Rubešová, Czech Visionary Center. I have one question about validation by clinician, by clinical experts. It was validated by experts, by some authorities.
Again, I will ask my colleagues who are closer to that process. Yeah.
So currently we of course we see ourselves as experts, but we don't have clinical experts that we're working with. We're now doing the ICNP translation and translation of microbiology, and we are planning to do with expert groups to really get the input from them. But for ref sets that are coming from the NRC, we're just translating it by ourselves and letting it review by the group, and which is an asset is the public feedback via the community content browser. So every user, researcher, whoever can put in their comments, and we can discuss it in the group. That's very helpful.
Do you want to
may I add that some of the value sets that we translated are translated actually by clinicians. So, for example, the microbiology set and the allergy set is translated by clinicians, and then we give it to the other NRCs, and the other NRCs with their competence look over it, and then it's released.
Joseph had a question. And then...
I think his hand above.
Thank you. Yes, Ingeniev, Germany. Yes, I think the question from the Norwegian colleague is very good. And you said it is important to fix on authoritative translations. The decision is another decision compared to interface terminologies. I think that is a tricky discussion, not to make an interface terminology in terms of translations of SNOMED content, and to separate both sides of the I think you can answer it really well.
Yeah, because interface terminologies is also something quite close to my heart, because I'm also working on an interface terminology, and I see things as clearly divided. So one is an official authoritative process, which then creates a resource of good translations, and interface terminologies, which mean that those terms which clinicians use, but which should perhaps not be displayed by a system, but which should be understood by a system, for instance, for term retrieval, for natural language processing. This is probably much more kind of grassroots activity, often put forward by, let's say, clinicians of a certain specialty who really want to, for instance, process their clinical texts, and which know that they have really crazy acronyms for things which they understand, but nobody else understands. And such resources are extremely important, but really they do not belong into a national extension. They belong in some kind of extension. Or Ref said there was yesterday was a discussion about this. I think this has still to be decided where such interface terminologies should sit.
Sure. Thank you, Michael Missoura from Germany as well. 3 small questions that might lead into one answer. I was wondering, do you have an understanding as to how many physicians are actually using the German translations already? How many hospitals? Is there a number? Second question would be, do you have a feeling of how much of the SNOMED CT is translated into German already? And if so, what could speed up the process to actually get more translations going? Thank you.
I think probably the answer of this would be more appropriate in 1 or 2 years from now. But the first answer, I think it's really just no, because it's at the very beginning. And well, this we have to accept. We cannot pull this out of the hat. Yeah, it required these 2 years of preparation. And then the second question, again, sorry.
Do you have a percentage estimate as to how much of the German or the English SNOMED International is translated already into German?
Percentage?
20%, 15%, less, 25%. Okay. But of course, there are some things which, for instance, organisms in Latin, which is easy to translate, and other things are.
That's why we did it first.
What's the statistics? Okay, so thanks for the questions.
Okay, thank you very much for an excellent session. I'm afraid we'll have to finish there. Thank you again. I'm sure if you see our presenters around, they won't mind answering some questions. If you want to scan the QR code when you go into your next session, if you're playing the online events game, and for our online attendees, if you go back into the lobby and then choose your next session. Thank you very much. Thanks.